What's going on, guys? Somebody on one of my other videos commented a really good question. They were talking about how in one of the last videos we were discussing the idea of confrontation and resistance and, not wanting to be a bitch or whatever. And they said, isn't that an egotistical decision or an ego-driven decision? And doesn't that sort of go against some of the things that I've said about the idea of keeping the ego in check? And I think that this is a really good question and something that is deserving of discussion to make a distinction between the ideas of ego, arrogance, or hubris, and also where honor comes into play, where our personal ego decisions have to take a backseat to these concepts of group honor. So, one of the first things to think about here is what the ego is, because so oftentimes nowadays we do hear about the ego as sort of always a negative thing, where people say, oh, that's the ego talking, or, put your ego aside when you go into the gym or when you go to train, and don't be egotistical and all this kind of stuff. But, psychoanalytically speaking, the ego is just the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious mind, and also an individual's sense of individuality, their sense of self and self-identity. So the ego in and of itself is not bad, just like brain is not in and of itself just bad. It's just something that exists. What is bad is when our sense of self-identity is out of step or out of line with what our self-identity really is, which is, of course, is defined by our actions and what we actually do. Not what we say we are or what we say that we do, which is something that we've touched on before in the past. And so, referring to this guy's question, I assume it was a guy, I didn't check the name, but we have to look at it and we say, well, what is the individual's reasons for engaging in something like this, or engaging in confrontation or conflict or whatever? No one can say for any certainty except the individual themselves, if they have a certain sense of honesty with themselves, for what reasons they are actually doing what they're doing. So for example, in a violent confrontation, or a situation that maybe didn't have to be violent but became a violent confrontation, one side or the other could be acting completely out of ego-driven insecurities or whatever, and decided to escalate it to that level because they were aware of how people were perceiving them, not necessarily a decision based on what was smart or what was the right thing to do or whatever. And we see this all the time, people's insecurities and self-esteem problems can create violent individuals and all this kind of thing. But we also see people walk away from fights for a number of different reasons. So, if you're on parole or something like that, and somebody is giving you shit at the bar and he's drunk or whatever, and you walk away from the fight, that's probably out of a sense of self-preservation or intelligence, a desire not to go back into a state of incarceration. That's probably a good decision. It's controlling the ego and not allowing yourself to be manipulated by the events and the individuals around you. But if someone, is like grabbing your girlfriend's ass, like sexually assaulting your wife or whatever, and it's fear that keeps you out of that confrontation, but you say it's because you don't want to catch a charge, or because you're the bigger man, or you're too old to be getting in fistfights at the bar. That's not necessarily anymore about ego. It's about fear, and we also need to understand this idea of honor when it comes into situations like this. One of my friends, Craig, had posted that great line from Bhagavad Gita the other day, and it talks about how, Arjuna's sort of going, Arjuna, I don't really know the correct Sanskrit pronunciation, but he's going through this crisis of inaction almost, because he's thinking too much about weighing the pros and the cons, and whether he's going to go to hell forever, for butchering this field of his enemies. And, his chariot driver says to him, you have to put away this unmanly bullshit. You have to quit sitting here and chewing over this stuff, and arise, scorcher of your enemies, and discharge your manly duties. So the fact is that we would all like to be sort of these enlightened bodhisattva warrior, kshatriyas or whatever. But the fact is that we still have to exist within this world, and that within this world there are still certain manly duties that any man worth his salt has to undertake, and one of those is protecting the people around us, and another one is our sense of honor and our sense of group honor. My good friend and brother Jack Donovan talks about the idea that in its simplest form, honor is the concept of never making your tribe look weak. That concept has been actually criticized by a lot of people, but I think that it's probably one of the best ways that I've heard it put, and I use that when it comes to myself and my friends. I also use it when it comes to myself and my relationship with my wife. I hate to bring that up because I know we're supposed to, in the Wolves, like, hate marriage and women and children and all this kind of stuff, but you know, in my marriage, I use that because I don't want to do anything that would make my marriage look weak to people on the outside of it. It's none of their business what goes on within the confines of my marriage, and all my honor requires me to do is to not do anything that makes that marriage look weak. So that includes, chatting or allowing myself to be chatted up in the bar, on social media, any of that kind of stuff, and essentially keeping a fucking sort of iron boundary around that thing and not talking about our problems to other people or any of that kind of shit. We work that out internally. And so this idea that, you are responsible to your friends and to the way that your friends, your gang, your tribe is perceived, that's not an ego-driven situation. That's an honor-driven decision, an honor-driven situation. So, those are a few things to keep in mind when we look at stuff situationally, whether it's ego or whether it's not, and that the ego is not always a bad thing. In order to do big things, we have to have a fucking big sense of self-esteem and self-identity. My brother, he just did an interview with Red Ice Radio, and I'll read through the comments on stuff or whatever, even though usually it just raises my blood pressure, but a lot of people called him a narcissist, and one of the guys, his little image was a picture, that great picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger doing this, and it's like, in order to make much of yourself, in some ways, you have to have this big sense of self-identity. And most of the interesting people, I'm not saying good people or bad people, but most of the interesting people I know have a very strong sense of self-identity and have a very strong opinion of themselves. So, the last thing that I kind of want to touch on with this, especially for the guys and gals that are part of Operation Werewolf, is to remember that hubris and ego are two different things. Don't be arrogant in anything that you do. Don't be arrogant in your training. Arrogance is like a stupid fucking young man's game. When I was younger, I was really arrogant. I thought I was really tough. I thought I was really strong, blah, 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 blah. I go in and I train now with guys, and everybody in the fucking gym can beat the shit out of me. It's not even a question. Where I train, there's a guy, Trevor, who trains where I train, who squats literally twice what I squat. I squat over 400 pounds. This guy's in there just making me look like nothing. And you're not special just because you go to the gym or you do jiu-jitsu or whatever. Everybody fucking goes to the gym. That's like something that you should just be doing. That's a given. Don't develop this sense of ego that goes along with like going to the gym. It's like, yes, we all want to look good and we should all like want to be strong and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But if you start finding yourself in this position of arrogance where you're shitbagging people or other people who maybe haven't been there as long or whatever, you're kind of missing the point. My mom always used to say when we were kids, let others' lips praise thee. It's from the Bible, but there's a lot of wisdom there. If you're doing things that are big enough to talk about, other people will be talking about them. And you don't need to remind people kind of how awesome you are all the time. Maybe spend your time reminding some other people who need the boost how awesome they are. But that these are things that are just expected. So if I can boil this all down to sort of one sentence and one piece of advice for anybody who may be watching this, just strive for excellence in whatever your area is and do it with sincerity and without arrogance. And also understand that retaining a sense of honor is making your chosen relationship / honor group not look weak, and that oftentimes decisions have to be made for honor that sort of don't have anything to do with ego. So anyway, until that day, keep training and doing all that stuff, and actually look in the times in between your training to do the things that are impressive with that training. 92. Merat minimum
Gangaya